2:14 in the evening, the mafia boss's mother looked straight into her son's eyes and whispered, "You're not my son." Rafael Bellaro froze beside her bed. Rosa Bellaro was 72 years old. She had raised him alone after his father was murdered, taught him which men lied with their eyes and which men lied with their smiles, and held the entire Bellaro family together, through years when everyone else circling that empire wanted nothing more than to see it collapse into pieces they could claim for themselves. She had survived things that would have broken lesser people, and she had done it with a silk robe, pearl earrings, and a spine of pure steel that nothing in this city had ever managed to bend. But now she stared at her only son like he was a stranger who had wandered into her bedroom uninvited. "Mama," Raphael said, his voice cracking on the single word, kneeling beside her bed and taking her hand gently in his. "It's me. It's Raphael." Rosa's sharp dark eyes, still carrying the ghost of the fierce intelligence that had once run half this city's underworld from behind her late husband's shoulder, moved over his face with something between suspicion and genuine confusion, and found nothing familiar there at all. "You're not my son," she whispered again, pulling her hand back. The private physician, standing near the foot of the bed, spoke first into the terrible silence that followed. "This is consistent with what I've been telling you, Mr. Bellaro. Rapid cognitive decline. It happens sometimes, faster than anyone expects." Carlo Bellaro, Raphael's cousin and closest advisor for over 15 years, stepped forward with the smooth, practiced concern of a man who had clearly been waiting for exactly this moment. "She needs a clinic, Raphael. Somewhere secured, somewhere with real medical staff who can manage this properly. She's no longer safe here, and frankly, neither is anyone she might turn on in a moment of confusion." Everyone in that room believed the old woman was simply slipping away, her mind dissolving faster than any of them had been prepared for. Everyone except the mocked caregiver standing quietly beside the medicine tray. Grace Bennett was 31 years old, dark chestnut hair pulled into a practical bun, dressed in a simple pale blue caregiver's uniform that made her look exactly like what the rest of that household had decided she was. Unremarkable, easily overlooked, hired 6 weeks earlier to measure out pills and change sheets. She had cared for her own grandmother through real cognitive decline once, and what she was watching in Rosa right now didn't match it at all. Real decline didn't come and go like weather. It didn't lift by morning and descend again like clockwork by evening. And Rosa Bellaro's confusion, Grace had already noticed over the past several nights, arrived within the hour after her evening pills, every single time, with an almost mechanical precision. She said nothing in that room. She simply crossed to the medicine tray, still sitting on the nightstand exactly where she'd left it an hour earlier, and opened it. Grace had filled that same pill box herself, every week, since her very first day in that house, carefully sorting each day's medication into its labeled compartment with the meticulous consistency her training had drilled into her. She knew exactly how Sunday evening's compartment should look, and it did not look right tonight. The tablets she'd placed there 3 days earlier were small, plain, and white, each one stamped with a thin identifying line across its center, exactly matching the prescription list taped inside the pillbox's lid. The tablets currently sitting in that same compartment were nearly identical in size and shape, but carried the faintest undertone of blue beneath the lamplight, and when Grace held one up close, she saw no line stamped across its surface at all. Her stomach went cold. She checked the small scratch on the inside of the pillbox's lid next, a tiny, distinctive mark left accidentally by her own thumbnail during her very first week of work. That scratch had always sat in the same spot, angled the same way, every single week since. Tonight, it sat slightly rotated, as though the entire box had been opened, refilled, and closed again by someone unfamiliar with exactly how Grace herself always handled it. Someone had gotten into that pillbox and changed what was inside it. Grace carried the box directly to Raphael's study that same evening, refusing to wait until morning, refusing to let this particular piece of evidence sit unguarded for even a few more hours. "Sir," she said, setting the pillbox down on his desk with hands that were steadier than she felt, "your mother isn't forgetting you. Someone is making her forget." Raphael's eyes lifted slowly from the papers in front of him, and something in his exhausted, grief-worn face sharpened instantly. "Explain that to me. Now." Grace laid it out carefully, the way she'd learned to explain complicated medical realities to frightened families over years of careful practice. The mismatched color, the missing imprint line, the rotated scratch on the lid, the simple, undeniable fact that Rosa's confusion never arrived until roughly an hour after these specific pills entered her system. "I don't diagnose people," Grace said. "I'm not a doctor, and I won't pretend to be one. But I watch what changes after the pills, every single day, for every patient I've ever cared for. Your mother's mind isn't failing on its own schedule. It's failing on someone else's." Raphael picked up one of the faintly blue-tinted tablets, turning it slowly between his fingers, and Grace watched something in his controlled fury settle into place, cold and absolute. "Lock the medicine room," he said, his voice dropping into something low enough that it carried through the entire house without ever rising in volume. "Nobody leaves this house until I know exactly whose hands have been in my mother's pills." Within the hour, the Bellaro estate had transformed into something closer to a fortress under siege. Red emergency lighting pulsed faintly along the corridor ceilings. Every exterior door sealed with heavy mechanical finality. Every staff member confined to the main hall while security began reviewing camera footage from the medicine room and every hallway leading to it. Carlo, watching the lockdown unfold with barely concealed impatience, insisted repeatedly that this was an overreaction, that pharmacies made mistakes, that Grace's theory, however well-intentioned, was hardly worth turning the entire household upside down over. Grace stayed close to Rosa through most of that first chaotic night, sitting in the chair beside her bed while the old woman drifted in and out of an uneasy, tampered sleep. Even confused, even frightened by faces she couldn't place, Rosa's hand found Grace's more than once in the dark, gripping it the way a drowning woman grips anything solid. "You feel familiar," Rosa murmured once, her voice thin and uncertain. "Even when the rest of it goes strange, you feel familiar." "I'm right here," Grace said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." It was a small thing, that murmured trust from a woman too confused to remember her own son's face, but it settled something firm and certain in Grace's chest, a resolve that had nothing to do with her job description and everything to do with the particular, stubborn loyalty she'd carried since her own grandmother's final years. The belief that dignity didn't disappear simply because a mind grew unreliable, and that someone, always, should be willing to fight for it anyway. She had promised herself, sitting beside her grandmother's bed all those years ago, that she would never again stand quietly by, while someone decided an older woman's voice no longer mattered. Tonight, that promise had found a new house to live in. "She is a caregiver, not a neurologist," the private physician said, his composure fraying slightly at the edges. "With respect, Mr. Bellaro, she is not qualified to make a claim this serious based on the color of a tablet. She wants attention because your mother likes her," Carlo added smoothly. "It happens with staff in households like ours. They start believing their proximity to the family makes their opinions matter more than they do." Grace didn't flinch. "I don't need to be a neurologist to know your mother changes after the wrong pills enter her system. I've filled that pill box with my own hands every week since I started here. I know exactly what belongs in it, and I know exactly what doesn't." Raphael looked between the two of them, something shifting behind his steel-gray eyes, and for the first time since Grace had arrived in that house, she watched him actually consider, seriously, and without dismissal, the word of the person everyone else in the room had already decided didn't matter. He found her later that night, sitting alone in the hallway outside his mother's room, a cup of tea gone cold in her hands, and lowered himself into the chair beside her without asking permission. "My father was murdered when I was 15, he said, staring at the wall opposite them rather than at her. "My mother raised me after that, built half of what this family became out of sheer will, because she refused to let anyone in this business believe a widow and a boy could be pushed aside. I have spent my entire adult life trying to be worthy of that. And 2 nights ago, she looked at me like I was nothing to her at all." His jaw tightened. "I don't know how to protect her from something I can't see." "You don't have to see it," Grace said quietly. "You just have to trust the person who does." Raphael turned to look at her then, something unguarded moving behind his tired eyes. Why does a caregiver 6 weeks into this job care enough to fight an entire room full of people who outrank her? Because I watched my grandmother's mind get taken from her slowly, over 2 real years, by something nobody could stop, Grace said. And I am not going to stand quietly in a room and watch someone take your mother's mind from her on purpose, in weeks, because it was convenient for somebody else. Something passed between them in that quiet hallway that neither one said out loud, and Grace felt it settle low in her chest, unfamiliar and a little frightening in a house already full of danger. Raphael didn't look away first. It was Grace who finally broke the silence, standing abruptly to check on Rosa simply to give her hands something to do besides reach for a man she had absolutely no business wanting to reach for. Rosa slept through most of that first chaotic night, and by the time she woke the following morning, sharp-eyed and dignified, recognizing Grace instantly and asking pointed questions about the sudden lockdown, Grace had already laid out the full comparison on a tray beside her bed. The correct medication from earlier in the week, still stamped with its thin identifying line, set directly beside the mismatched blue-tinted tablets pulled from Sunday's compartment. When one of the junior maids stammered through an excuse for a delayed breakfast tray, Rosa caught the small inconsistency in her story before the girl had even finished speaking, the same quick, unforgiving attention to detail that had once made her one of the most respected minds in her late husband's entire organization. It was, Grace thought, watching this sharp, formidable woman catch a lie with total clarity, nothing at all like the frightened stranger from the night before. "Your mother didn't forget your face," Grace said quietly, once Raphael had joined them, holding both tablets up side by side in the morning light. Someone changed what went into her body. Raphael stared at the 2 nearly identical pills, and Grace watched the full weight of it finally land on him completely. Not simply that his mother might recover, though that alone brought a visible, staggering relief to his exhausted face, but that someone inside his own guarded, carefully controlled world had deliberately, patiently made his mother appear to be losing her mind. "Who has access to that medicine room?" he asked, his voice gone dangerously quiet. "Housekeeping restocks the tray weekly," Grace said. "But the room itself is locked, and the log shows only authorized signatures. Except," she paused. "The signature logged for last Thursday's restock doesn't match the housekeeper's handwriting from any other week. It's close. Close enough that nobody checking quickly would notice. But I've seen her sign that log a dozen times now, and this isn't her hand." Raphael's jaw tightened. Someone forged the log. Someone with access to a master key, Grace said, and enough familiarity with this house's routines to know exactly which pill to swap and when the mistake would matter most. Over the following days, while Rosa recovered slowly under close watch, waking each morning sharp and clear before the fog rolled back in each evening under the tampered dosage, Grace found herself compiling detail after detail that pointed, with increasing certainty, toward one specific corner of that household. For a short while, suspicion drifted toward the housekeeper responsible for restocking the pillbox each week, a nervous, soft-spoken woman named Delia, who had worked in that house for nearly as long as Carlo himself. Raphael's men questioned her hard, and Grace watched the woman's hands shake under the weight of accusations that clearly terrified her, understanding, not for the first time, that fear made almost anyone look guilty enough to matter. "She restocks the tray," Grace said finally, stepping in before the questioning went any further. "But she doesn't have a master key to the medicine room itself. Someone let her in, or someone went in after her. Look at who signs the log immediately after her name, every single week." It was the kind of detail nobody else in that house had thought to check precisely, and it cleared Delia within the hour, narrowing the search back toward the small, trusted circle of people who actually carried master access to that room. The camera covering the hallway outside the medicine room carried a small, persistent blind spot near the linen closet, one that required a master keycard to bypass the motion-triggered recording delay, a system detail few people in that house would even know existed, let alone how to exploit. Staying Grace cross-referenced the access logs herself, staying up long past her shift ended, and found that same blind spot activated at almost exactly the times the pillbox would have needed tampering, always on days when most of the household's senior staff were occupied elsewhere. It was Rosa herself, slowly regaining her footing over those recovering days, who handed Grace the piece that finally made everything make sense. "I knew you were my son in the morning," Rosa whispered to Raphael one clear-eyed afternoon, her voice still fragile with the particular shame of having looked at her own child and seen a stranger. "I always knew it only left me at night." "Mama, you don't need to apologize for something someone did to you," Raphael said, his voice rough. "I'm not apologizing," Rosa said, though her eyes were wet. "I'm telling you how frightened I was, watching pieces of my own mind disappear on a schedule I couldn't understand, and not knowing whether anyone would believe an old woman insisting something was wrong when everyone with a medical degree kept telling her otherwise." Grace, sitting nearby, found the small leather notebook Rosa kept on her nightstand and, with the old woman's permission, opened it to the most recent entries. Rosa's handwriting grew shakier as the pages progressed, but the words themselves remained sharp, deliberate, urgent. After blue pill, fog. Carlo came before dinner. Don't sign clinic papers. Tell Raphael before I forget. You knew, Raphael said quietly, staring at his mother's careful, desperate handwriting. Ideas are the beginning points of all fortunes. I fought it every night, Rosa said, her voice trembling. I wrote what I could remember before the fog took it. I was afraid nobody would believe an old woman losing her mind over what she scribbled in a notebook. I believed her, Grace said quietly. Every page. Carlo's motive, once the full shape of it surfaced, ran far deeper than a simple bid for control over an aging matriarch's care. Raphael's own quiet investigation into the household's older financial records, prompted by Grace's discoveries, revealed a pattern of missing funds stretching back over a decade, money diverted through accounts Carlo alone had managed since the earliest years of his position as family advisor. If Rosa's mind remained sharp, if her memory stayed intact and her instincts stayed trusted the way they always had been, that theft carried a real risk of eventually surfacing under her sharp, unforgiving attention. But there was something older and darker beneath even that. Rosa's notebook, in its earliest entries from weeks before the pill tampering ever began, held fragments of memory that had started resurfacing on their own. An old key, an old debt, a night decades earlier surrounding the death of Raphael's father that had always officially been ruled the work of a rival family. Rosa had begun, slowly and without fully understanding why certain details kept surfacing, to remember things about that night that didn't match the story everyone had accepted for over 20 years. A car that hadn't belonged to any rival. A face at the edge of a memory that belonged to family, not enemies. Grace read those early entries aloud to Raphael one quiet evening, watching his face change with every line, watching 2 decades of grief and certainty crack slowly open into something far more painful than simple loss. The lamp between them burned low, and neither of them reached to brighten it, both instinctively understanding that some truths were easier to hear in dim light. She wrote, C was there before the shots, Grace said carefully. 3 separate times, on 3 separate pages, weeks before anyone changed a single pill in that box. She wasn't confused when she started remembering this, Raphael. She was starting to remember clearly, for the first time in 20 years, exactly what actually happened that night. Raphael sat very still for a long moment, staring at his mother's careful, deliberate handwriting. Carlo was 15 minutes away that night. He told me himself, years ago. He said he arrived after, that he found me standing over my father's body and got me out before the police came. What if he didn't arrive after? Grace said quietly. Raphael said nothing to that. He didn't need to. Something in his face had already answered the question for both of them. If Rosa's memory remained clear, if she kept writing down what surfaced, kept talking, kept being believed, she represented the single greatest threat left to secrets Carlo had spent over 2 decades protecting. He hadn't simply wanted control of an aging woman's care. He had wanted her silenced, her credibility destroyed so completely that nothing she ever said again, about pills or memories, or the true story of a murder 2 decades old, would carry any weight at all. Carlo made his final move 3 days later, arriving at Rosa's door with the private physician in tow and a set of clinic transfer papers already prepared, choosing a moment when Raphael had been called briefly to the security office to review the household's newest findings. Grace was already in the hallway when she saw them approaching, some careful instinct having kept her closer to Rosa's room than her actual schedule required that particular afternoon. "Move," Carlo said, not even slowing his stride. Clearly assuming a caregiver in a pale blue uniform posed no real obstacle to anything he intended to do. "You change sheets and count pills. You don't understand family business." "I count pills for a living," Grace said, stepping directly into the doorway and holding her ground. "That's exactly why I know which one you changed." Carlo's composure flickered, just slightly, and Grace pressed forward before he could recover it. "The forged signature in the medicine log doesn't match the housekeeper's handwriting," Grace said. "The camera blind spot near the linen closet only opens with a master key, and there are exactly 3 of those in this entire house. The blue-tinted pills don't match any prescription on Rosa's chart, and her own notebook has been documenting every single symptom, every visit, every warning, since long before any of us started paying attention." "She's a caregiver telling fairy tales," Carlo snapped, though something in his voice had begun to fray at the edges. "An old woman's confused scribbling proves nothing." From the bed behind them, Rosa's voice cut through the tension, clear and sharp in a way that silenced the entire hallway. "You always hated that he loved me more than he feared you," she said, looking directly at Carlo with the full, unclouded force of the woman who had once helped run half this city's underworld. "You thought if I disappeared into confusion, he would finally listen only to you instead." Raphael arrived in that same instant, drawn by the sound of his mother's voice carrying such sudden, unmistakable clarity, and the sight of Carlo standing in that doorway with clinic papers in hand told him everything he needed to know before another word was spoken. "You tried to steal my mother from me," Raphael said, his voice dropping into something Grace hadn't heard from him before, low and absolutely without mercy, while I was standing right beside her bed the entire time. "I was protecting this family," Carlo said, his composure fully collapsing now. "From what she remembers, from what she was starting to say out loud about your father's death, I did what I had to do to keep this family together." "Tell me what actually happened that night," Raphael said. 20 years, Carlo. You owe me 20 years of the truth in the next 30 seconds." Carlo's face went through something raw and desperate, the careful mask of 15 years finally cracking apart entirely. "It was never supposed to go that far. Your father and I disagreed about a shipment, about money he thought I'd mismanaged. It became an argument. The argument became something neither of us could take back. I told myself for 20 years it was self-defense, that I had no choice, and every year it became easier to believe my own story instead of the truth. And when my mother started remembering the truth instead," Raphael said, "you decided it was easier to make her look insane than to face what you actually did." "She was going to destroy everything," Carlo said. "The family, my life, 20 years of loyalty. I'd given you since." "Loyalty," Raphael repeated, the word coming out of him like something bitter and final. "You poisoned my mother's mind to bury a truth about my father that belonged to me, not you. You let me grieve a lie for 20 years while you sat beside me at every family dinner, every holiday, every hard decision, and called it family." Carlo had no answer left worth giving. Raphael's men moved in immediately, and within moments Carlo Bellaro was being escorted from the house he had spent 15 years quietly, patiently exploiting, his careful decades of hidden theft and older, darker secrets finally unraveling all at once. The private physician broke shortly after, confessing everything the moment Raphael confronted him directly with the pill records and the household's own supply logs. "He told me it was a formality," the doctor said, his hands trembling as he spoke. "That your mother's memory was already unreliable at her age, that the clinic transfer was simply cautious planning, nothing more. I never asked why the symptoms didn't match a real progression. I told myself it wasn't my place to question the family's own decisions about her care." "You told yourself that," Raphael said, "while writing a false diagnosis into my mother's permanent medical record." The doctor had no answer that survived that sentence. He confessed the rest quickly after that Carlo had paid him steadily for weeks to keep insisting on a dementia diagnosis, regardless of what the actual symptoms suggested, providing exactly the kind of professional cover that made Carlo's plan to move Rosa into a controlled clinic environment look like sound medical advice instead of a calculated theft of an old woman's voice. By the following morning, there was no version of Carlo Ballaro's future left standing inside that family. Every account he had touched was frozen and traced. Every quiet arrangement he had built over 15 years of trusted access was unwound, piece by careful piece, by men who now answered only to Raphael directly. Every associate who had ever taken instruction from Carlo either came forward with what they knew or disappeared from the city entirely, rather than be found standing anywhere near his name. The physician lost his license within the week, his confession providing exactly the evidence needed to formally clear Rosa's medical record of a diagnosis that had never once been true. Rosa, once the worst of the tampered medication had fully cleared her system, sat up in bed one morning and looked at her son with total, unclouded clarity. "There you are, my boy," she said softly. Raphael crossed the room and pressed his forehead gently against his mother's hand, something Grace suspected the most feared man in this city had not allowed himself to do in a very long time. When Grace tried to quietly step out and give them privacy, Rosa's hand shot out and caught her wrist, refusing to let her leave. "She listened," Rosa said, looking at her son, "when all of you had already decided I was gone." Raphael looked at Grace for a long moment, something unguarded and grateful moving behind his tired eyes. "You didn't save my mother because she was my mother," he said quietly. "You saved her because she was still a woman worth listening to." "Old women don't disappear," Grace said, "just because powerful men stop listening to them." Raphael was quiet for a moment, studying her the way he had that very first terrifying night, except there was nothing suspicious left in it now, only something raw and unguarded he clearly wasn't used to letting anyone see. Raphael didn't offer her money. He didn't offer her some quiet transfer to a different, safer household position designed to end her involvement with his family as cleanly as possible. Instead, in the days that followed, once the worst of the danger had passed and Rosa's recovery had settled into something steady and real, he asked Grace whether she would stay on in a new capacity, not simply as a caregiver measuring pills, but overseeing every detail of his mother's health and safety, with an authority in that household nobody would ever again think to question. Grace hesitated. This world frightened her, the danger she'd stepped into without fully understanding it, the ease with which someone like Carlo had operated undetected for over a decade inside a house full of guards and money. "I don't know how to live surrounded by this much danger," she admitted to Raphael, standing in the quiet of his study, with the offer still sitting unanswered between them. "I took this job because I needed steady work, not because I wanted to become part of a family that has to lock its own doors against its own blood." "Neither did I choose this life, in the beginning," Raphael said. "It chose me the night my father died, and I spent 20 years believing loyalty and fear were the same thing. You've shown me, in 6 weeks, that they're not even close to the same thing." He paused. "I'm not offering you danger, Grace. I'm offering you a family that has finally learned to actually listen before something terrible happens instead of after." He reached out then, brushing a strand of hair back from her face with a gentleness that startled them both, his hand lingering a moment longer than the gesture required. Neither of them moved away. "That's not the only reason I'm asking," he added quietly, his voice rougher than before. Grace felt her pulse climb, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest, even as every practical instinct told her to step back. She didn't step back. It still wasn't enough to fully settle her fear, not that evening. She went back to the small guest room she'd been given near the staff quarters and lay awake much of the night, weighing the quiet, ordinary life she could still choose against the pull of an old woman's hand gripping hers in the dark, insisting she stay, and against the memory of Raphael's hand against her cheek, gentle in a way she suspected very few people in his world ever got to witness. It was Rosa who settled it, a few days later, taking Grace's hand in both of hers with the same fierce, deliberate grip she'd once used to hold this entire family together, through years of danger far worse than anything Grace had witnessed. "If I forget again," Rosa said, "I want your voice in the room. Not because I doubt myself, because I know how easily powerful men decide an old woman's mind before they've actually listened to her." Grace stayed. 6 months later, Rosa Bellaro was sharper and more formidable than she had been in years. Her mornings and evenings equally clear now, her sharp dark eyes missing nothing that happened in that household. She managed her own medications personally now, with Grace's quiet oversight rather than anyone else's control, and the small leather notebook that had once been filled with desperate, fading warnings now held nothing more urgent than recipes and old family stories she wanted to make certain Raphael never forgot. Rosa had taken to hosting small Sunday dinners again, something she hadn't done in years, insisting Grace sit at the table as a guest rather than staff, teaching her, over several weeks, the exact proportions of her late husband's favorite sauce, passed down through decades of careful memory that had nearly been stolen from her entirely. Grace learned to set a table the old Sicilian way, learned which stories Rosa told when she was happy, and which ones she only told when she trusted the person sitting across from her completely. And somewhere in the space of those quiet Sunday afternoons, she stopped thinking of herself as an employee in that house at all. Rosa liked to tell the story now, whenever new guests joined those Sunday tables, of the night a caregiver in a pale blue uniform refused to let go of a pillbox while half the room told her to hand it over. She told it with the same relish she'd once reserved for old family legends, dramatic pauses included, always ending the same way. "And that," she would say, patting Grace's hand, "is how I got my son back, and this house got the only person in it worth trusting completely." Raphael watched all of it unfold with the particular, careful attention of a man relearning how to simply sit still in a room without needing to control every detail of what happened inside it. He had spent 20 years building walls, guarding secrets, running an empire on distrust as much as loyalty, and slowly, over 6 quiet months, he had begun to understand that the safest version of his family wasn't the most heavily guarded one. It was the one where somebody was actually listening closely enough to notice when something was wrong before it became a catastrophe. He had also begun, quietly and without announcing it to anyone, to look for reasons to be in whatever room Grace happened to be standing in. Raphael no longer made decisions about his mother's care without first hearing Grace's careful, observant judgment, and the household staff who had once looked straight through the quiet caregiver in the pale blue uniform now understood, without needing to be told twice, exactly how much weight her word carried in that house. One evening, Rosa pulled out an old photo album, worn soft at the edges, and paged through it slowly with her son beside her, pointing out faces from decades earlier with total, steady recognition. She looked up at Raphael, smiling, her sharp eyes clear and completely her own. "I never forgot you," she said. "They only tried to make me lose the door." Raphael looked over at Grace, standing quietly near the window the way she always did, watching without ever needing to be asked, and understood, with a gratitude he suspected he would carry for the rest of his life, that she was the one who had found her way back through that door and opened it again. Some evenings, once Rosa had gone to bed and the house had settled into the particular quiet of a home that no longer needed to guard against its own shadows, Raphael found Grace in the kitchen or the garden, or simply sitting with a book in the small sitting room she'd claimed as her own, and he lingered longer than any conversation strictly required. Neither of them rushed toward naming exactly what had grown between them in those 6 dangerous, transformative months, though it had become, by then, an open and gentle thing neither one bothered pretending not to notice. A hand that lingered a beat too long, a chair pulled just slightly closer than necessary, a good night that took considerably longer to actually leave the room than it should have. It was enough, for now, that she was still there each morning, that Rosa reached for her hand before she reached for anyone else's, that the house finally felt like somewhere worth protecting instead of merely controlling. Grace Bennett had walked into the Bellaro household as a caregiver nobody thought twice about, dismissed by a doctor who trusted his own diagnosis over the evidence in his own hands, mocked by a family advisor who believed a woman in a pale blue uniform could never see through 15 years of carefully hidden betrayal. She left that first terrifying week having found the one truth an entire household of money, medicine, and long-standing trust had missed completely, and in the months that followed, she became the one person in Raphael Bellaro's guarded, dangerous world that both he and his mother had learned to trust without a single condition attached. If this story kept you holding your breath the way that Pillbox held the truth, hit that like button right now. Share it with someone who believes the people who actually sit with our elders notice more than any doctor rushing through a 5-minute visit ever could. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, would you have checked that pillbox, the way Grace did, when everyone else in the room had already decided the old woman's mind was simply gone?